Thank you very much, Christian Schmid. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that you are all still here. This is great. And it is also fantastic to see how a very special material, a small material that seems to have to do very little with urban design, could have a great impact. And if I just think of last night's cable car ride to the mountain, without this capacity of steel, probably also the whole course of this town and other towns would have taken a very different course. So this is our world in which we operate here, these very, very different scales. And I would like to introduce the panel as soon as the chairs are here. And when they are here and the panel has taken place on it, then we can go a bit deeper into that. So let me tell you a bit how this will work. It will be Daniel Küper, Laichu Maloney, and Kees Christianse on the panel. And this is a very good opportunity to revisit many of the points that we talked about in the last 3 days, and also to put them in context with the ongoing discussion on future cities, on Zukunftsstädte, and also give you different perspectives from another angle. There is a slight change of program, as you noticed, because the two gentlemen who were supposed to be in this panel in the first place, Alfredo Brillambourg and Hubert Klumpner, two things happened. First of all, they won the Golden Lion in the Biennale in Venice, as you might know, for their work in South America. This is the reason for the absence of the first person, of Alfredo. And the second one, Hubert Klumpner, has a family obligation with his father that he had to take suddenly, and therefore he cannot be here. So I thank very much the two other panelists that stepped in and literally will step in now with Daniel Küper first, and then Kees Christianse and Laichu Maloney. May I ask you to come upstairs? So after they are introduced briefly, I will give you a quick tour of the big picture, which maybe also makes it clearer for you why we chose these particular topics that we have and the particular people. Because in the end, it is all about people, who speaks to what topic and how convincingly they can do that. And after this, then we will take their statements to the topic of the future city and how in their particular situation where they work in, they address this topic. And after this, it's open for questions and discussions with you. And of course, in the end, we want to have final statements on they see the future development of these cities. So I think we are ready now. Let me start with Daniel Küper. Daniel Küper is from the Institut für Politikwissenschaften of the University of Zurich. And very important also to our topic here, he is participating in the National Science Foundation of Switzerland, the NFP 65 Neue Urbane Qualitäten, New Urban Qualities. And his particular topic is on urbane Brüche, lokale Interventionen, Perspektiven einer suburbanen Planung. And this is, if you remember the discussion of 2 days or 2 nights ago, very, very interesting, because that's what we were discussing about. So Daniel Küper, maybe I give you the word for a few statements on other things you want to say about your life. Just briefly.
Okay. Thank you, Gerhard. So it's true, I'm involved in the NFP 65. The context of our project in the NFP 65 is basically the context of Switzerland's urban growth and, of course, the pace of growth. And we know since a long time that this pace of urban growth in Switzerland, especially the form and the pattern it takes, is not sustainable. There is the very famous 1 square meter of soil consumed per second, and the official policy is to promote infill development, densification, in order to to limit urban sprawl, Zersiedelung as it is called in German. And so this is basically the policy goal that is or should be pursued by authorities at several state levels. Now the problem is there is a strong resistance against infill development and densification, and the municipalities are at the core of this resistance. And I like to quote the famous quip by Christian Herzog, ist Christian, anyway, in der städtebauliche Porträt, who says that die Gemeinde ist das Anti-Urbanitätsmolekül der Schweiz. So it means the municipalities are the anti-urbanity molecule in Switzerland. Basically what he means by that is if you let the municipalities do what they would like, they would let urbanization happen as basically low density, single family housing, therefore driving urban sprawl even further and soil consumption even deeper. So I'm a political scientist and we are interested in knowing how state authorities can steer urban development, and in the particular case we are interested in why municipalities are supposed to be the Anti-Urbanitätsmolekül in Switzerland. We want to know whether this is true, what instruments they have to steer urbanism and urban development in Switzerland, and if they have instruments, why they don't use them. So what we do more precisely, we have a couple of case studies, a bunch of municipalities at different sites in Switzerland, sites that are characterized by large urban growth pressure. For instance, one of our sites is the region in Oberwallis, Brig, Visp, Nates. You all know that there has a new tunnel being done, the Lötschberg linear, which puts heavy growth pressure on this region because people can live there and commute to Bern for a job. So this is a heavy growth pressure over there. There are other examples of municipalities that we study that face heavy growth pressure due to new transport infrastructure such as the S-Bahn or such as a new motorway or other growth pressures. Now what we're looking at is how these municipalities deal with these growth pressures and what instruments they use in order to steer the growth they face. And especially what we're looking at is what paradigms of urban quality they have, how they transform them into policy goals for their municipalities, and what kind of legal instruments they use. And I don't know if I should go on, because I could go on for a couple of... I think this, I'll leave it to this, and we will have the opportunity to come back to some of our findings concerning these instruments.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we are here right in Switzerland with your contribution. Thank you very much. Lai Chu Malone Lee, the professor from National University of Singapore, I do not have to reintroduce, but just to make, I think, Lai Chu, you heard that the problems or the opportunities of doing urban renewal or doing urban changes in Switzerland are radically different from Singapore, and I'm sure you will talk about this a bit more, and you talked about this in the morning presentation already. And the third person that you have not seen yet here in this conference is Kees Christianse, Professor Kees Christianse, and he's the one who is actually the one who designs, who is the urban designer who actually designs and builds these cities or parts of cities from ETH. And Kees, I also want to give you the opportunity to say a few words about your work, just to explain to people where you come from.
Yes, I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm already 9 years in Switzerland now. And I actually am the successor of Frans Oswald at ETH. I'm the head of the Institute of Urban Design since 2003. And I'm also the principal of KCAP Architects. And in that role, I am one of the master planners, for instance, of the Harbour City in Hamburg and of the Olympic Legacy in London, and here in Switzerland for the Europa Allee, the big development next to the railway station in Zurich. To which you also can see that I'm very strongly working in urban renewal in dense areas like railway station areas, harbors, and former factory areas. I'm also one of the program leader group members of Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore, together with Frans Oswald, Stephen Cairns, and Tessina Schenk. We coordinate the content of the overall researches of Future Cities and try to develop it as a responsible set of interrelated researches. Although we do not pretend to develop a manual to build future cities. And I am also responsible for Module 4 of Future Cities, which is Urban Strategies and Resources, which is consisting of 2 researches. One is called Urban Breeding Grounds, and deals with so-called creative or diverse neighborhoods in inner city areas, which are having very different scales, a diversity of social groups, diversity of building typologies, which lead to a certain cultural and microeconomic quality for a city. And the other research that we are doing is airports and cities, and we are researching the urbanization influence that goes out from airports in relation also to the change in mobility.
Thank you very much, Kees, and this is some of the things he's doing, and as we will see later, there's many more things to that. Let me start off by a few, not provocative, but a few other statements. I also want to introduce how this whole thing works in Singapore and why we work like this. But start off with Switzerland. After all this talk about the densest cities and the beautiful cities and the densification, Switzerland, after all, compared to many other places, is still a low-density country, but it is the country where Einstein started his career. It's #1 and #2 now in the universities in continental Europe overall. It has the #1 cities in the world, #2 sometimes, #3. It is #1 in competitiveness, #1 in innovation, and it's a very resilient country. And this can be done also not by having huge cities, and we think that some of the success of Switzerland is actually related to the specific setup of cities and countrysides here. The SEC that you have heard many times over the last days, this is the Singapore ETH Center for Global Environmental Sustainability. And apologies, my name is Gerhard Schmidt. I'm the director of this SEC. And within this SEC, there's the Future Cities Laboratory as the first large program. And I tell you a few things about this program and the vision of this SEC, because the Future Cities is not the only program that we intend to do. It is just the first one. And it will hopefully be followed up next year by a second program on future resilient systems, and then maybe 2 years from now on a third program on future food security. And we think those things belong together. And as you have heard from the talks this morning and also from yesterday and before, you can see the strong relations with these things. The city, the countryside, food, resilience, risk are very closely interconnected, and we want to study these things with the researchers from Switzerland. So the Future Cities Laboratory is the first one taking place in Singapore. Here you see a different view of Singapore from a typical residential areas looking down on the seaside. This is the sea right behind those buildings. And the future resilient systems, of course, people associate with that countries or systems like Switzerland, the next one. And then on future food security systems, we have to look into many alternative new ways of dealing with food security. Stephen Kearns this morning gave you a hint where that might lead. The normal view we follow is a very old one, but a very useful one. This is the urban metabolism, understanding the city as a complex system. And yesterday when you heard Ludger Hoferstadt, you got glimpses how complex the system can become or how we should look at it in the future. So we read and model this system in terms of stocks and flows, also a very old idea from the 50s, from the 60s, from economics originally. But we recognize these urban stocks and as basic elements of the urban metabolism and as locally available resources. So that's where you see Dirk Hebel's urban farming in this sense, or the urban farming from yesterday, tied in very closely. This overview you cannot read, and it is very yellow, but you will see all we did in the last days in a later stage where it belongs. But what you maybe can recognize on the vertical columns, these are the scales, the small scale, the medium scale, the large scale, and on the horizontal lines, these are these different stocks and flows that we deal with. These are the places we are active in the Future Cities Laboratory. It's a different type of world map from Buckminster Fuller. Some of you might know this representation, but in the last days, when we look what we talked about, there were people who talked about very more or less generic points in terms of urban planning, urban history, urban futures, and then there were ones who were very, very specific. So looking at the students from Ethiopia, or Franz Oswald presentation, or Marc Angelil presentation from South America, Dirk Hebel now focusing on those possibilities in this large area around the world with the new material, Stephen Cairns focusing on the rice fields, Lai Chu Malone Lee on the density in Asia. And the first day, remember Professor Wada on the energy future of the cities in Japan. Professor Leipengut, then of course Europe and the colder climates and expansion to warmer ones. Jane Jacobs on specific European events that have taken place and happening to European cities. And the evening discussion is also a part of the whole picture, very important because it went right down to the local level, anchoring everything here in Switzerland. And I don't want to forget the Prior from the first day. We come back to that. So this is the research questions that we pose ourselves. Which methods can increase the sustainable performance of cities? And more important one, how can we develop a new curriculum of urban science for the future? Because all these things we bring across here in 3 days, they will be lost unless we are successful in transforming them into teaching, into bringing them to the next generations. And we start with the very earliest generations, with the children actually in the Future Cities Lab, and go all the way to the senior citizens. A quick run through what these particular parts are. On the small part, Leipengut, you saw him yesterday, focusing on experimental things. You saw the building he showed and the big installation we have here in Switzerland already. It's digital fabrication from Camazio and Kohler, which you see in places here at ETH, now transported to Singapore, and where they think they can actually build in the long run high-rises with robotic construction. By the way, this morning while you were having breakfast, I was agreeing with the provost from NUS that we finally can have the first really co-taught master study in digital fabrication between ETH and National University of Singapore. So there are many ties developing there. And then studying density from a Swiss and Singaporean perspective, Sascha Menz. On the medium scale, the historic preservation with Uta Hasler, and this is also what Kees Christiansen referred to, the rapid development of a city like Singapore, and look at the one food center that is in the center, how it changed from 1910 to 1980 to 2000. And the working roadshow that Kees was mentioning, also which is historic preservation. In yesterday's Straits Times, it was a big article on roadshow areas, diversity attracting researchers. So it's like a reflection on our work in Singapore being presented in Singapore. You haven't seen that yet, huh? Yeah, I just got it this morning. And then there's Kees himself. So he working on airports also, and also in the Singapore context on the new airport. He will maybe say more about it. Christian Schmid, you heard him this morning on the urban sociology. And Marc Angelil in South America, in Africa. You saw these examples here. On the landscape ecology, very important issue. Christophe Giraud working on very vicious places like Jakarta, the Ciliwung River with colleagues together and students. And Kai Axhausen concentrating on the transportation systems in Singapore and other places. and mobility, transportation planning, already looking, this is not a section through the Swiss Alps, but it's just a section through the peaks and valleys of the transportation access of people to different transportation modes, and the planning of every individual Singaporean, 5 million individual agents being programmed in a simulation program, which is a quite scary thing, but in the end, this is what is actually happening. And finally, the simulation platform that I'm running myself with many people together. And this is the platform where all these heated discussions on the new models on looking at the city are erupting. And these are really partially eruptions. What you saw yesterday from Hoferstadt is not always that friendly, as he mentioned at the beginning. Sometimes it's really harshly discussed, and rightfully so. New methods of self-organizing maps that he showed, also showing there, are being explored. And then the three assistant professors, small scale, medium, large scale. Small scale, Dirk Hebel, you just heard him, and you can see he's a designer and architect. So whatever passes on the smallest scale has impact on the larger scale. Then Alex Lehnerer, he is assistant professor for the urban design. He is focusing more on rules and regulations in a city. This is very much related to what Daniel Kübler will talk about. And finally, Milica Topalovic, she's focusing on the large scale. And there you can see everybody was talking about hinterland and hinterland of Singapore. This is her work that is different nations forming the hinterland of one specific country. There are many things that happened. 2 years ago, when Dominic Gallagher and I started to work on this conference, we were just going to Singapore. That was September 2010. We started with 2 people. Now we are, 2 years later, 157 people, 9 principal investigators and affiliated faculty from NUS and NTU, assistant professors, senior researchers, 52 PhDs, 53 master students, and you see all these articles, 89 academic articles, 11 books, science to industry talks, and so on. So it's a big group already, which is starting to have impact in this area and beyond, and this is a very, very active point. So coming back to this unreadable diagram in the beginning, now I placed what you were talking about in the last days, also for the benefit of our members of parliament, like Mrs. Ricklin. And you can see now, if you look at the small scale and the stocks and flows, for example, of materials and space, Jane Jacobs, the urban farmers definitely, and also Anton Picon, who was talking about the ephemeral on the information technology in the cities, in the buildings, in the small to medium scale. Then the evening discussion, extremely important, was on the local scale, but also reaching into the medium scale. Then, of course, Professor Wada talking about the big scale of a whole country like Japan. And Professor Lepple also on the big scale, global scale, so that goes into the large scale, the territorial scale. The same for Malone Lee, Lai Chu, and Stephen Kerms this morning. And here on the other side, this is just the people who are talking on the technical fields like Leipung Gut in the small scale, Dirk Hebel, small to medium scale. The city performance group, I think, was fantastic in the first day, the opening, because they represented the cultural parts of the city of the past and maybe of the future. The Ethiopian students, Franz Oswald, Marc Angelil, Christian Schmid in the large scale, Ludger Hoferstadt also the information and large scale, and Zong Chen and Antti Kunze on the simulation. And the Brio, of course, he was talking for an organization that exists since 2000 years, is very global, and has many of the sustainability issues dealt with in the past, present in the villages and the large cities. So that was very interesting opening of the whole conference. So with that, I would like to open the discussion in the forum, in the panel, and ask my colleagues for very short statements on what they see as the most significant, not problem, but maybe a solution path to the future city in the place where they are living now and in the place where they do most of their work, because that might not be the same. So, Lai Chu, maybe if you would like to start with this. After all these talks, all these things you heard, what would you say is your most pressing issues that you see?
Okay. Well, I think, firstly, I don't think I can speak on behalf of Asia, as you may say, because we are a little red dot in this huge continent with very, very large-scale issues and concerns. But what is clear in Singapore, as well as in terms of also the kind of issues that we will encounter in Asia, I would say are two major components. One, I would classify under the human part, which is the well-being, the healthy city, the quality of life, the livability aspect. But the second, which is connected, is the resource aspect. And I didn't think we have, perhaps we touch on this aspect a bit. There's a bit about food, there's a bit about land, that's also about material. But if you start to bring these components together, I think really we have to deal with the resource issue. The whole idea of talking about density is because we just have this amount of urban land and we need to use it efficiently. And how do we use it in a way that improves people's life? So it's a resource use, it's a resource productivity. And density is really, I always say, it's just a number. At the end of the day, is how you layer it into the city in terms of the multifunctionality. So if you say it's a residential area and you just put people, and in the daytime, people leave their homes and they go to the city. The homes are empty, the city gets crowded, the roads gets crowded. So we really need to look at how can we tie up these different components and look at our cities as in terms of the multiplicity of users, the multifunctionality, so that we can be very efficient. We can layer it upon the other to actually understand this whole concept of, we talk about the complex system. And I think we need to deal with that. But coupled with that is, when we talk about resource, is food and water. And Asia in particular, when the cities expand sideways, it takes up a huge amount of good agricultural land. And I have some statistics on this. In the last couple of months, we've been dealing with this food, energy, water nexus. It's water that's been used and is as part of agriculture production. 70-80% of urban water is actually used for agriculture purposes. And at the end of the day, rice from Thailand gets exported out to Singapore, gets exported out to other cities. And in that production of the rice, there is that precious urban water that's been used for that purpose. And energy. Each time we explore new ideas and new innovation, it's all about using energy. Singapore is world stressed, and we say we have some ways to solve that problem because we use what we call new water. We reclaim water. But when you reclaim water, it's energy intensive. You have to find new ways of actually looking at renewable energy. And materials. I think when Dirk talks about the whole consumption of materials, and we understand that all too well, because every time there is a huge construction boom in any city in Asia, there's shortage of steel, shortage of sand, shortage of aggregate, and it happens around the cities, the same city. So you have the building of the Olympic Stadium in Beijing a few years ago, and the whole of Asia is out of steel. So really, and it's a metabolism because it's all within a a system that we assume that it's not here, it's there, but it's all part of one single system. So I think the resource issue has to be addressed as part of our future city agenda. I think that's really critical.
Thank you. So that is obviously very different from here, because Singapore has to import 94% of its food, and much of its water, has no own energy resources, no dams, no nuclear power plants, no other power plants, just gas. So it is a very, very delicate situation. It's understandable that this is on the very high on the list of things to attend. If you look to now to Switzerland itself, Herr Kübler, what did you find in the most concerns in the places you worked with?
Yes, so I'm talking basically about Switzerland and the pressing issues that I find are detectable there. As I said in the beginning, there is a growth problem in Switzerland. I mean, we've crossed the 8 million population level this summer, and the projections are that the growth is going to continue. So this creates a number of challenges for the development of the urban fabric. And interestingly, it's if you look at the history of urban development in Switzerland, there has been a period where we feared the decline of the core cities. From the 60s, 70s onwards, the large cities, Zurich, Basel, Geneva, Bern, Lausanne, they all lost population. So they were decreasing, people were moving out, cities were losing attractivity. I think we have reversed this trend now. The core cities are back on the agenda, they are self-conscious, they are strong, they claim more political clout in the system. And if you look at the population figures as a crude measure of development of these cities, they all increased in the last decade. So I think the growth, the core cities are a bit out of the problem. The main problems of urbanization in Switzerland are seen in the suburban areas, where you have the most of the growth that is absorbed. And the problem there is in my view, not a very conscious management of this urban growth. And if you were talking about, promoting teaching in urban science, this is, I think, what is urgently needed in these areas. Often, suburban communes or suburban municipalities don't conceive themselves as part of the urban areas. They conceive of themselves as old, countryside municipalities where there are some farms and they have a tradition, a past, and local customs and so on and so forth. And as someone in the past, I don't know who it was, said very rightly, you don't build a good city when you dream of the countryside. And this is probably one of the problems in the suburban areas in Switzerland. They also lack not only the self-consciousness of the fact that they have become urban in the process, they also need to think about how they want to steer their urbanity and what their urbanity is. So I think there is a little bit of what I perceive as being a lack of self-conscious urban development in the suburban area. And this creates a number of problems which we can maybe talk about later.
Thank you. I mean, you didn't have the benefit, also Kees Christianse not, and Lai Chu not, to understand what was discussed in the Wednesday night's meeting with the population here, because the panelists then, which were among them, the former mayor of Zurich and other very prominent people who are actually doing the planning and are confronted with these problems, actually that was one of the conclusions they also came to. So there seems to be really a focus that has to be dealt with in the future, very seriously. But again, you in the audience who have been here from the very first day, maybe you have seen or you remember Professor Wada's image of how Japan imagines the future of the sustainable city, which some of us were thinking this is not possible, this cannot be, because we have seen that before. So that was basically a vision of, again, the reuse of the urban sprawl, basically as energy sources to produce clean energy for living and for mobility, and thus giving a new life cycle to this already existing urban sprawl. But maybe we can come back to this later. So this is a very sensible topic. And Kees Christiansen, maybe because you work in so many places, what do you see as, let's say, in the place where you work most as the thing to attack? Because it's obvious you cannot give one answer for all of these places.
I come from the west of the Netherlands, the Randstad, which is one of the most dense urbanized areas in Europe, and also one of the most suburban developed areas in Europe. Therefore, I'm always extremely relaxed when I hear talking about Switzerland, because for me, Switzerland is a kind of rural idyll still, and the problems are really quite easy to overlook, but that by the side. I would like to continue on what Mr. Kubler said about the self-conscious, the level of self-consciousness of the suburban field, because I experiment this explicitly in my practice, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I clearly tie it to the level of complexity of the governing structures in terms of also of experience and education. For instance, if you have a town planning department and if you work in the province, the quality of the leader of the town planning department of a very small city somewhere in the province, in terms of experience and complexity, is lower than in the center of Zurich. And so if you are confronted with suburbanization problems in the periphery of larger cities, where you have smaller rural communities that have become suburbs, and you have the core city, there very often is a very strong gap between the quality of knowledge and the experience of governance and the development of policies on the core city side against on the suburban side. And this is a real problem, which is difficult to solve, because of course a career of a civil servant goes from a small town, and then he promotes to a middle-sized town, and then in the end he arrives in the core town and he becomes the director of a group of 50 people, and that's the kind of top of his career and also the top of his experience, knowledge and complexity. So in that respect, the emergence of regional governments that deal with complexity both on the agglomeration scale as well as on the lower scale is very important and also very interesting, which you also observe partly in Switzerland. Second thing I could stress on is we are living in Western Europe and I'm not particularly optimistic or pessimistic, so I would ask you to see this observation as an observation by me. I experienced that Western Europe is one big networked city consisting of 500, 600 cities of between 50,000 and 500,000 residents. Middle-sized cities in the relation to the global scale, with an average distance of about 100 kilometers, excellently connected by train, by road, and also a little bit further between the network nodes by airplane. There is a cultural landscape between the Western European cities that is, although there's an aggressive suburbanization on certain areas, relatively well intact, and it is also theoretically possible for the Western European population to produce their nutrition in an autarkous way when they would want to, and when economy would not work according to the natural rules that it works to. In this Western European context, there is a high tradition of social democratic governance, which also reflects itself in the processes that I just mentioned. And there's also a high development of quality of technology, which results also in a very sophisticated amount of knowledge on sustainable technology. And so my provocative observation is that the area in the world where that mostly has the best opportunities to arrive at a sustainable condition, potentially, I'm not saying that it is Western Europe. And also has the best quality of life in terms of climate, relationship between built and unbuilt, between nature, cultural landscape, and built-up area, in terms of water supply, etc., etc. And I think this is a very favorable and interesting condition, which is not something to be so proud of, but is something to value very much, and always keep in mind when you start complaining about Europe and about the crisis in Europe. Because there is a crisis, but the condition, despite the crisis, is considerably positive. And it also shows in the export of knowledge and industry that we are doing to other countries in order to implement sustainable technologies, sustainable visions, and sustainable policies. So, for instance, if we work in Singapore and we look at the city of Singapore, we see that Singapore is working very effectively on a technological, sustainable city and on an economically stable society, and also on a social acceptance of the government by the majority of the population. But you see that the urban form in which this is reflected, which is strongly a top-down development, is done according to modernist principles that date from before the war in Europe and America. And so, if you look at the plan of Singapore, of the street pattern of Singapore, and you look at the pattern of these streets, then you see that the city center and some areas around it have a street pattern of blocks which have a multi-directional street pattern in which there are building blocks that have multiple contact planes and grade levels towards the public space. And if you look at the rest of Singapore, you see monofunctional business parks, housing estates, shopping malls that have single access and that create islands that do not communicate with each other. So if you go to a new town like Punggol in Singapore, you will find, I'm exaggerating, it's better than I tell you, but you find a metro station, you find a shopping mall, a hawker center where you can eat, and some social activities, and then you find a kind of acres full of development of housing towers. And so this condition is difficult for a microeconomic emancipation of the population in a post-Fordist condition. The post-Fordist society needs mixed-use areas with a lot of contact planes in which microeconomic initiative can flourish in order that people can emancipate themselves in a diversified way. And so we are working, for instance, on the last areas in Singapore that we consider as potential structures that can accommodate this microeconomic expansion, if you like, on the one hand. And at the same time, we are looking at these new towns and see whether we can insert certain concepts by means of which these new towns can transform into more mixed use and more emancipatory spaces. As a last example, I would like to go to Java, where my father was born. As Dutchmen, you have such a thing very often. So in that respect, I'm also very grateful to be able to work on Batam and Indonesia and so on, because it's a little bit in my genes. If you go to Java, you see a kind of comparable urban condition as in Europe, in the sense that you have a lot of multiple nodes of medium-sized cities that are very tinily intertwined. But you see that the state of knowledge, the state of development of economies, from very rough, large-scale economic actions to very small-scale rice paddy actions like Stephen, is very strongly conflicting, and that the level of government is so bad and so corrupt that the transitory development towards sustainability is extremely difficult to accomplish. And it also shows that it is useless to work as an urban planner on urban structures. It's useless to work on a sociology level on the policy structures. It has to be done in an integrated way. And I think one of the promises of our Future Cities Laboratory is in the terms of curriculum, which Gerhard was mentioning, that partly by doing what we are doing and also partly by starting to design it, we are developing a kind of set of disciplines that together may build an interesting curriculum to teach people inside and outside Europe, and especially also in the Asian context, where we also work in several countries, to be able to tackle urban problems in an integrated way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kees. So I think that gives you a pretty good picture of the whole bandwidth. We're working in countries with high-tech, the first two examples, with low-tech, or also with no-tech, as Brillenburg would name it. And this gives you the one bandwidth. We hear there is a population growth problem in Switzerland, and this always makes me smile, because if you think really Singapore with 5, soon to be 6 million inhabitants is exactly the size of Lake Geneva. And if you have a growth problem in a country with 41,000 square kilometers, that in this context seems to be very remote. Yet there is this in perception. And this, I think, is a good place to start with now, opening up to the audience to ask questions to this issue.
Elaborate on one point.
Yes, go ahead.
As you said, there is, well, it's a perception of a growth problem. I think that the problem is not so much the growth issue in suburban municipalities, but the problem is that if you ask yourself whether the way it's managed is improving or not, I can't see improvements. That's the concerning issue. In fact, I think there are places where you have a downward spiral. And let me explain the downward spiral of urban quality in suburban areas. Places, as you mentioned, that are not connected to the rest of the urban fabric are also happening in suburban areas in Switzerland. There are, shopping malls built on the green grass and so on. And the problem I see is that the lack of knowledge of urban planners in these places produces an urban fabric that is favorable to some types of political values. For instance, I've been participating in a comparative research project where we demonstrated that low-density single-family housing favors right-wing liberal attitudes in politics. I can explain if you like. This creates political majorities in these suburban municipalities that are in favor of a lean state. Low taxes, no big administration, outsourcing of public services if possible. The problem is then you won't get a good town planner in these places, because politicians who are elected, of course, we are in a democracy, elected by the population who have certain preferences, will not be willing to invest in building up administrative capacity that is needed to actually counteract these tendencies. So that is the downward spiral that you produce. And this is a fact that one has to take into account when we talk about suburban development. It's not just the problem of the level of issues, and that will be, evened out at some point in time. But the problem is the self-reinforcing tendencies that make the suburban development as it is, namely not towards good urban quality.
Okay. Now, questions to that.
This is working? Okay. Hi. Actually, it's not a question. This is like a comment. My name is Rawan, and I'm coming from Jordan. This is one of the areas that it's not in the, let's say, the concentration of the discussion, but it's one of the areas that also share lots of problems. And actually, I want to emphasize the importance of the point that Professor Kobler have talked about, which is one of the problems we are facing with the local governance authorities, either in urban areas or rural areas, that they are pro-urbanization, they are pro-additional areas for development, and they're pro-pleasing their electoral votes people, rather than thinking of the sustainability of the areas that they are governing. And in addition to the challenges that we have, let's say, we lack resources, energy resources, we lack water, we're the country number 4 poorest in water worldwide. We lack the proper vision for these areas, but also we're being challenged with the governance resistance for any sustainable thinking to develop either urbanized areas or rural areas. So this is actually one of the major challenges that we try to work with. In addition to working with, let's say, public participation, including the citizens in the planning process, bringing new planning methodology, we had also this challenge of dealing with the capabilities of the technical teams and the resistance of the administrative authorities within these regions.
Thank you. So there, of course, Singapore has a solution for everything, because they have the World City Summit, to which they invite all the mayors, where you can take courses to solve these problems. I don't mean this in a funny way, but there's something I think we can learn from that to increase competence, and also to get a bigger picture in situations like that. It's, I think, not the case in Switzerland that we try to export this type of planning or good planning possibilities, because it's a fact that the Swiss cities are ranked really number 1, number 2, number 3 worldwide for livability and all of these things, yet we do very little to export it. Singapore, however, does do that, so there is a certain tension. But thank you for this observation, which is very, very true. Yes.
But there are many initiatives, bilateral initiatives in this level. For instance, the city of Zurich completely designed and governed and coached the planning authorities of Kunming in China. Several cities in Germany and Holland are also having these kind of adoption condition. There are many initiatives in where also governing principles, stakeholder management processes, policy developments are exported.
On a bilateral level. Yes.
May I just answer your comment, in the sense that I'm not sure if participation and participatory planning necessarily leads to a development that is going to have a higher urban quality. Because if you look at people's local interests, their local interest is to protect private property, and this is nothing very, let's say, promotory of elements of urban qualities such as parks, open space, public space, etc. So I think what is also needed in terms of, because you're thinking of export of knowledge, is maybe coaching or let's say training investors to see the benefits of good urban quality. Because if you look at the municipalities in Switzerland, often the problems they face is that they are dependent on the investors, of course, for the development of the urban fabric, and they are unable to impose to the investors goals that they would not want to pursue by themselves. And what do they want to pursue? They want to pursue the highest benefit ratio of their investment, which means, they think, Eigentumswohnungen, privately owned flats at the maximum density that is possible. Although you could as well benefit as an investor from investing in flats that are sold in a location that has a large urban quality, high urban qualities, open space, parks, accessibility, livability, eventfulness, everything. So I think there is also a lack of framing the way in which investors can think about urban quality. That would maybe be so investors, I don't know if you tap into I guess you must have them as some of your users, publics in Singapore, but I think in Switzerland especially, that is a bit of a problem, especially if you look at the large institutional investors such as pension funds.
Yes. Maybe some investors are even here in the audience, we don't know. So please ask questions in this respect. But Casey wanted to say something to that.
Yeah, I see here some positive little lights, because as I said before, you can see that larger corporations are tending towards sustainable technology. And you also see with investors, especially in dense harbor cities, for instance, that they acknowledge that producing urban quality not only gives a better quality of the city, but also gives them in the long run more revenue. And I think this is the driver also of the fact that, for instance, Siemens and McKinsey are heavily interested in dealing with cities and smart grids and I don't know what. And I think that's a very positive trend, because if sustainable development and technology and urban quality become profitable, then that will trigger much more activity than we as preachers try to convince people to do things that are not profitable.
Thank you. More questions from the audience. Oh, sorry, Lai Chu, you wanted to answer to this too.
I think it's important to perhaps place cities in that kind of a development continuum, if I may put it that way. You have, on the one hand, we talk about Zurich, and then in case Singapore and perhaps Tokyo. These are really advanced societies with technology, with the human capital, with the sophisticated institutional systems that we can deal with, and we can handle new ideas, new innovations. And then you look at the other end of the spectrum, you look at some of the African cities, you look at some of the other cities in Asia. And then in between, you have the growing second tier. Cities are ready to go, ready to innovate, but waiting to actually, for the new opportunities. And I really don't think that you can start really exporting those ideas straight away and say, I want this to happen, and leapfrog into the new regime. So we are very clear about that. Singapore developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s with this whole modernistic, this whole approach of top-down, this whole approach of government managing and controlling. It was good for its time. It was important then. You need to manage it in that way. And then it's moved on. And I think today, there's all these ideas of the microeconomy, the ideas of looking at smaller areas, looking at the little creative areas. And there are a lot of these things are now emerging, and I think there's a need to start to change as well. But I don't think change could happen overnight. There's a certain level of inertia that you have to overcome. And I think that is the difficult part. And really bringing this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and the interaction with external parties, I think that really helps a lot. But I'm really cautious, I'm very skeptical about us. Singapore has a fairly successful new town model, and I don't agree for it to be exported to, Indonesia or to Thailand or to Hanoi and any of these cities as it is, because it has been built up with a whole lot of legal and political and institutional type of intervention that doesn't exist in those kind of other places. So we have to think about some other ways of doing it. And I really think that sensitivity has got to always stay at the heart of this, anything to do with transfer of knowledge or transfer of technology.
Thank you. Sensitivity, obviously one of the most important things when you deal with people's future, especially their living conditions. Last questions from your side on the topic or on also previous topics from the last day, trying to see differences or common streams. We saw the infrastructure forcing people to leave because that is the schedule of this very well organized part. In this case, I think it would be good to have some final remarks from each one of you to the way ahead, as it's always called. Also maybe going back to Mr. Wada's vision and your comparison of these or suburban areas of Switzerland and Germany and France and all over Europe, possibly getting another life through technology, which suddenly would also lead to another attitude, if that is possible. But let's start with Lai Chu again, final concluding remarks on the conference and on the topics that you heard here.
Well, I think it's been a very rich conference, covering so many different aspects, and there are common threads that actually link some of these issues together in terms of resilience and sustainability, in terms of also, harnessing technology, and I think more importantly, lest we forget, at the core of it all is always people, and I think if I were to just sort of leave the last word, I think at the end of it is really about well-being of the people who live in these cities, and I think that is something that we need to be extremely conscious about in the different things that we do. Yeah. Thank you.
Well-being.
Yeah.
And Dania?
I think what I take home from the work that I've been doing in the NFP 65 and also from what I've seen here in Engelberg is the importance of the ideas. I mean, I believe in the power of ideas as a tool to coordinate policy, to influence investors' decision, to influence people's decision, to make good planning. And in this way, I think the Future Cities Lab is particularly important in that it has a huge clout in the international community in order to be able to promote the core ideas of what sustainable urban development should be it in the fields of technology. I mean, I was absolutely amazed by this presentation today on the, what's it called, high tensile fiber technology, which is, and I think the same needs to be achieved, and I think it hasn't yet, at least not in the NFP 65, about the definition or, let's say, core elements of what good urban quality finally is. Is it public space? Is it more? Is it eventfulness? Is it other things? And I think our duty is to continue research on these important things and make them clear, make them statements that are to the point that they can be transported out into the world and into the world of planners, of people and investors, frames when they make decisions about urban development. And I think this is the power that we can bring to the future development of our cities. And I think that is why these conferences such as this here, and also why programs such as the NFP 65 or the Future Cities Lab in Singapore are very important.
Thank you. And Kees Christiansen?
Yes, I didn't attend the conference, so I don't know what has been said. But I can say something else. I think we must value the value and authority of urban design. Because if you see a well-designed place of well-designed urban quality, this has an enormous value both on the cultural as well as on an economical level, as I said before. You see a very big discrepancy between city center focuses on quality, For instance, if you look at the highways in Singapore with their trees and their greenery, that's an intervention of design and quality. If you imagine that was not there, then you come down to Seoul in Korea or something like that. It's horrible. If you look at peripheral areas, there is, which is also in accordance with Daniel's remark, a lack of design quality, which is already increasing this negative spiral. And so the value and authority of design is extremely important. But at the same time, we cannot design cities. People tell me then, okay, what about Masdar? Masdar is not a city. Masdar is a big building put into the desert with a big entrance and a big exit. We cannot design cities. I always say we tend cities like gardeners. We can have influence on the development of cities, but there are also things that we have hardly influence on, or that we have influence on in a collective unconscious process that we do not yet control or understand, or so. So this tending urban quality is extremely important, and in that respect we have to learn, we have to research in what way you can have impact on change and transformation, and in what way you cannot have impact. In other words, what works and what doesn't work, and in which complex relationships. That's the most important task of the connectivity between urban design and urban planning, which are two different disciplines, but which are extremely important as drivers of a complex cloud of disciplines in which urban economy, sociology, etc., sustainable technology also have their role.
Thank you. This is almost a very nice last word. I want to end with a thank you and an apology. Apology first. We always do the same mistake again. We talk too theoretically, we talk too much over the top maybe, we talk in different contexts, we talk in jargon, abbreviations, all the things that we know but many do know. I really do want to apologize for that if that has happened. But I thank you even more for your patience going with us through this, and also being very interactive in the last 3 days. And I want particularly thank my two people who we could do the program or work on the program together, Stephen Cairns and also Philip Block. And this big thank you to you, the audience, I want to give back to the president of the Academia Engelberg. Thank you very much.